Today, I am in the room with the pathetic excuse of a man who will now, finally, be held accountable for his actions.
My dad lay at the front door, bleeding to death.
In March of 1980, somebody walked into a house in Ventura, California, tied up a lawyer and his wife, and beat them to death with a log from their own fireplace.
Also known as the original Night Stalker and East Area Rapist, terrorized California residents.
The Sacramento Sheriff's Office has invested over 40,000 man-hours in the past year in the search for the East Area Rapist.
It took 40 years, a fake profile on a genealogy website, a spit sample from a stranger's garbage to figure out who did it. And when they finally did, he'd been a cop. For years, working the same California streets he was terrorizing at night.
Authorities came close to finding the Golden State Killer more than once, but always came up empty-handed.
The DNA that cracked this case, the DNA that ended one of the longest manhunts in American history, came out of that house, off that bed. And the daughter of the man who died there has spent the years since not entirely sure it should have been used the way it was.
I have work to do. There are laws that need to be changed. I'm going to look for a state legislator to work with me on some of those laws. There are things we need to fix, and we still need to fight for justice being equal, and we still need to fight.
This is Season of Crime. What's coming isn't just a murder, it's a wrongful prosecution, a decades-long manhunt, and a killer who turns out to be one of California's own police officers, hiding in plain sight the entire time. By the end, the same evidence that finally caught him will end up rewriting how every cold case in the country gets solved. Subscribe for more videos.
Very pleased to announce that this morning in Ventura County, we have filed capital murder charges against Mr. D'Angelo for the March 1980 murders of Lyman and Charlene Smith.
Ventura sits right on the coast, about an hour up from LA. People move there for the weather and never really leave. High Point Drive was a quiet street there in 1980. Nice houses. A church sat right across the road from one of them, close enough that on a Sunday you could hear the organ from the front lawn. That house belonged to Lyman and Charlene Smith. Lyman was 43, a Ventura County attorney, and not a small-time one. People talked about him like he was headed for a judgeship. His daughter Jennifer has said his ambitions actually went a lot further than the bench. She's put it this way: he wasn't just angling for a robe, he wanted the governor's office. Maybe the Senate after that. He'd grown up in Pocatello, Idaho, and moved out to California with his family as a kid, back in 1945. By 1980, he'd built a life so far past that childhood, it looked like a different country. Charlene was 33. She'd started out as Lyman's secretary, that's how they met, and by the time they married, she was building something of her own, an interior design business, plus a sideline selling gold jewelry. She wasn't riding on his career, she was building hers next to it. Between them, they'd pulled together a blended family. Lyman had 3 kids from before, Jennifer 18, Jay 15, Gary 12. All 3 were living close by with their mother, but they were in and out of that house on High Point Drive constantly. Holidays, weekends, still one family, even split across 2 addresses. 2 years before any of this, in an entirely different part of the state, during a completely unrelated attack on a different woman, a man sobbed out a phrase in the middle of assaulting a woman. 4 words. Investigators who eventually heard about it figured she'd misheard him, figured he'd said, "Mommy." Nobody wrote it down as important. Nobody connected it to anything. It just sat in a file for years, filed under things that didn't add up to much. It had nothing to do with Lyman or Charlene. Not directly, not yet. What their life actually looked like, from the outside, was about as solid as it gets. A respected lawyer with a future. A wife building her own business. 3 kids who still came around. A house across from a church, on a street where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Nobody on High Point Drive had any reason to think the world outside that house was closing in on them, but it already was. There was nothing to see coming. That's worth saying plainly, because it's the part people always expect, and the part that never actually shows up in this story. No threats. No break-in attempts. No prowler reported on High Point Drive in the weeks before. Whatever was coming toward the Smiths wasn't coming from inside their life. It was coming from a stranger who'd never met them. Charlene's former mother-in-law, a woman named Isabel Doyle, called the house not long before it happened. It was an easy, unremarkable call, the kind two people who like each other have without thinking twice about it. Charlene told her about a new condo she was decorating and invited her to come see it. Lyman picked up partway through with his mouth full, laughing about something. Kids' voices in the background. They said their goodbyes, hung up. Isabel Doyle would turn out to be the last person who ever spoke to either of them. While all of that was happening, the condo, the phone call, a Saturday like 100 others, a man was already working his way south through California, and he'd already killed. 3 months earlier, in December of 1979, up in Goleta, just outside Santa Barbara, a couple named Robert Offerman and Deborah Manning were shot to death in their home. Same general method behind it. A home invasion at night. A couple targeted together. No warning. No forced entry that made sense. He'd started as something else entirely years before that. A masked rapist working Northern California towns, house after house, going back to 1974. But by the winter of 1979 into 1980, the pattern had shifted. He wasn't just breaking in and assaulting people anymore. He was killing them. Nobody in Ventura knew any of this. There was no reason they would have. Goleta was a different county, a different case file, a different set of detectives who had no reason yet to think their killer was headed south. The dots that would eventually connect Offerman and Manning to Lyman and Charlene Smith didn't exist yet, not as a theory, not as a rumor, not as anything. That connection was still 20 years away. What existed, on that Saturday in March, was just a house, a family that would be together again soon, the way they always were. A wife excited about a condo she was decorating. A husband with a mouthful of food and somewhere he was probably supposed to be, going into a judgeship no one had any doubt he'd get. And somewhere out there, closer than anyone in that house could have guessed, a man who'd already killed once was moving. The night of March 13, 1980, whoever came to that house on High Point Drive didn't force his way in. There was no broken window, no splintered doorframe, nothing that ever explained how he actually got inside. He was just there. Lyman and Charlene were in their bedroom. He tied them both up, wrists, ankles, using drapery cord pulled from somewhere in the house, knotted with something almost deliberate about it. A decorative diamond knot, the kind of detail that later made investigators think this wasn't his first time doing this. He went outside to the woodpile they kept by the house and brought back a log from their own firewood. That's what he used to kill them. Both of them. Blunt force, over and over, until it was done. Charlene was raped before it was over. There was no struggle that made sense to anyone who saw the room afterward. No sign either of them had fought their way anywhere. Whatever he did to control that room, he did it fast. And he did it in a way that meant 2 grown adults never got the chance to fight back. He left the way he came. No property taken that anyone could find missing right away. No note, no message, nothing pointing at anyone. Just a bedroom, and 2 people who weren't getting up again. Their 12-year-old son found them. That's the fact that sits underneath everything else about that night. Not the knot in the cord, not the log from the woodpile. A 12-year-old boy walked into that house expecting an ordinary Saturday and found his father and his stepmother instead, and there was no way to prepare him for that, because nobody had any warning it was coming. By the time anyone in a uniform arrived, whoever did this was already gone. No name, no face, no motive that jumped out at investigators standing in that room. Just 2 people who'd been alive that morning, a family that would never look the same again, and absolutely nothing to go on. This case went cold. Not slow cold, actually cold. No suspect, no arrest, nothing. For 2 decades. Ventura investigators worked it as an isolated tragedy. A lawyer, his wife, someone with a grudge, or something to gain. Nobody had any reason yet to connect it to Goleta, or to anything happening 200 miles north. And when this case finally did produce its first real suspect, its first real prosecution, a name investigators were confident enough about to bring charges, it was the wrong man. Detective Gary Atkinson caught the call that day. He'd end up supervising the response alongside Captain Paul Leidick, who took charge of the investigation from the start, and working the scene with them, on his very first homicide as a Ventura officer, was a rookie named Dave Stone, the kind of case a young detective never forgets, whether he wants to or not. There was a medical examiner on scene too, a man named Dr. C. Peter Speth, and what he did that day would matter more than anyone realized at the time. Rape kits back then got sent to the crime lab and handled, thawed, tested, refrozen, thawed again for the next round of testing. Every cycle degraded the evidence a little more. Speth knew that. So instead of collecting 1 kit, he collected 2. Nobody was thinking about DNA yet. The technology to run it barely existed. He just thought ahead. That decision would sit in a freezer for years before it meant anything at all. In the meantime, investigators did what investigators do. They looked at the people closest to the victims. Charlene had a long-running affair with a man named Rick Atwood, a former deputy sheriff. That went into the file. Charlene's friend Maureen Doyle noticed jewelry missing from the house afterward, which raised the obvious question of whether this had been about money, or theft, or something personal that had simply gotten out of hand. Nobody working the case in March of 1980 was thinking about a masked man who'd already killed once up the coast in Goleta. Why would they? There was nothing yet. No shared method flagged. No database. No reason to think this Ventura crime scene belonged to a killer working his way through the entire state. As far as anyone investigating knew, this was contained. A tragedy specific to one house, one couple, one set of relationships close enough to have motive. That theory would drive the investigation for years, and it would eventually put the wrong man in a courtroom. The theory investigators landed on wasn't random. Lyman Smith had a business on the side, a cattle investment venture called Maverick International, put together with a partner named Joe Alsip, and Maverick was in trouble. Money trouble. The kind that gets people asking uncomfortable questions about who benefits if a business partner disappears. An English auditor working for one of the company's investors had already exposed some of the accounting as, to put it plainly, not what it claimed to be. So when investigators started looking for a motive, they didn't have to look far. A partner, a failing business, a financial mess that a murder would very conveniently simplify. Then 2 things happened that turned suspicion into a prosecution. A Ventura County Jail inmate named Roosevelt McGowan told authorities he'd heard Joe Alsip confess to the murders. And separately, this is the part that still doesn't sit easily, an associate pastor at Ventura Missionary Church, the Reverend Don Mikell, came forward and said Alsip had confessed the killings to him directly. Mikell wasn't some outsider looking for attention either. He served as chaplain at a weekly prayer breakfast for peace officers. He had credibility with exactly the kind of people who'd be deciding whether to believe him. A police lieutenant named Randy Adams took that information and ran with it. Deputy DA Pete Kosaris built the case. Alsip was charged with the murders of the man who'd once been his business partner, and the woman who'd once been that partner's wife. He had a public defender first, a man named Paul Clinton, then a private attorney named Richard Hanawalt. Judge Bruce Clark presided over the hearing, and it fell apart. Here's the thing. Nobody's ever fully explained why McGowan and Mackel said what they said. Maybe McGowan wanted something out of it. Maybe Mikkel genuinely believed what he'd heard. What's not in dispute is what happened next. The case against Joe Alsip didn't hold up, and decades later, when DNA finally identified the real killer, it identified someone who had absolutely nothing to do with Alsip, Maverick International, or any of it. A man spent years under suspicion for murdering his own friend. He didn't do it. While all of that was playing out, one detail from years earlier was still sitting untouched in a file 200 miles away. Back in 1978, during an assault that had nothing to do with the Smiths, a man had sobbed out a phrase while he was attacking a woman. The phrase investigators had chalked up to a mishearing, filed away as mommy, and moved on from. Nobody connected it to anything for a long time. But investigators working the wider case, because by now, this wasn't just Ventura's file anymore, had a theory. Cops think, but never confirmed outright until much later. Whoever this was had a real person in his past named Bonnie. A mother, a wife, somebody. They kept that theory in the back of their minds for years, waiting for a suspect it might actually apply to. Eventually it did. A newspaper clipping surfaced, an old piece from the Auburn Journal, and it named a woman named Bonnie Colwell, once engaged to a man named Joseph D'Angelo. The engagement had ended years before any of this. Whatever it did to him, however it sat with him, he carried her name into a stranger's bedroom in 1978 and screamed, "I hate you, Bonnie," while he assaulted her. Nobody's ever proven exactly what that meant to him, but it stopped being a mishearing the moment her name had a face attached to it. By 2000, DNA had already linked the Smith murders to that same wider series, the East Area Rapist, the killer now being called the Golden State Killer, one man responsible for both the Goleta shootings and what happened on High Point Drive 20 years earlier. That was confirmed, and it reopened everything. But it still didn't have a name. That took until 2017, when a Contra Costa County investigator named Paul Holes tried something nobody had tried at this scale before. He had the crime scene DNA profile, the exact profile that came out of that bedroom in Ventura, out of the kits Dr. Speth had the foresight to double up on decades earlier, uploaded to a free public genealogy website called GEDmatch. Using an undercover profile, working with a genetic genealogist, they built out a family tree from genetic matches alone, cousin by cousin, methodically eliminating branch after branch until one name was left standing: D'Angelo. Investigators went and got his actual DNA off something he'd thrown away, ran the comparison, and it matched. That's the DNA, the one that finally answered what 2 decades of investigation, an entire wrongful prosecution, and a name nobody understood for years had all been circling without ever landing on. And it's worth sitting with where that DNA came from before we move past it. It came out of the Smith house, off that bed, the sample Dr. Speth thought to preserve twice, back when nobody could have imagined what it would eventually be used for. Jennifer Carroll, Lyman's daughter, the same 18-year-old who once sat in a courtroom watching the wrong man get charged, has said plainly that she was never fully convinced the arrest justified what came with it. Millions of people who'd uploaded their own DNA just to look up a family tree had, without knowing it, made themselves and their relatives searchable by police. Other families in this same case saw it entirely differently. Debbie Domingo McMullen, whose mother was murdered by this same man, would later stand in a courtroom and say the devil loses and justice wins. 2 women, the same killer, 2 completely different feelings about how he finally got caught. Here's something Carroll has said since, in her own words, that DNA shouldn't be something a person can just Google, and the numbers back up why that unsettled her. Once investigators proved this method worked, it stopped being rare. Today, a huge share of Americans with European or sub-Saharan African ancestry can be identified through a genetic database, not because they personally took a test, but because a distant cousin did. The case that caught D'Angelo also opened a door nobody's figured out how to close since. On April 24, 2018, investigators arrested Joseph James DeAngelo. He was 72 years old, a retired cop, living an unremarkable life in Citrus Heights, outside Sacramento, the kind of quiet nobody would have looked twice at. The next day, Ventura County District Attorney Greg Totten stood at a podium and charged him with capital murder for what happened to Lyman and Charlene Smith. Jennifer Carroll found out the way a lot of people that week did, not from a phone call, but from a headline. She's described it as disbelief that turned into something closer to shaking, 40 years of not knowing, suddenly resolving into a name and a face she'd never once considered. The wrong man had been chased, charged, and cleared decades earlier. The right one had been wearing a badge the entire time investigators were looking everywhere else. On June 29, 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo pled guilty. 13 counts of first-degree murder. 13 kidnapping-related charges tied to the rapes that came with them. It was part of a deal. Prosecutors across 6 counties working together agreed to take the death penalty off the table, and in exchange, DeAngelo admitted to all of it. Not just the 13 charged murders either. He admitted to 161 separate crimes against 48 victims, stretching back years beyond anything anyone had ever formally charged him with. The plea alone doesn't tell you what that courtroom actually felt like that August, because before sentencing, victims got to speak, not statements filed on paper, people standing up, addressing him directly, after decades of never getting the chance. Debbie Domingo McMullen was one of them. Her mother, Cherry Domingo, had been murdered by DeAngelo in Goleta in 1981. She stood in that room and told him plainly,
"Today, I am in the room with the pathetic excuse of a man who will now, finally, be held accountable for his actions."
She called him a pathetic excuse of a man, finally being held accountable. Jane Carson Sandler spoke too, one of the women DeAngelo had assaulted decades earlier, back when he was still working as a masked stranger, breaking into houses at night. She was the woman from 1978, the one who'd heard him sob a phrase into the dark that nobody understood for almost 40 years. She stood in that same room and said it back to him, out loud, on her own terms this time. On August 21, 2020, Judge Michael Bowman sentenced DeAngelo 11 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole for the murders. 1 more consecutive life term on top of that for the kidnapping counts.
The aggregate sentence for Joseph James DeAngelo is the following. For counts 2 and 14 through 13, he's committed to the state prison for the indeterminate term of 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The sentence to run...
Effectively, a sentence with no bottom to it, the kind of number that stops meaning anything specific and just means never again for the rest of his life, under any circumstance. Before it was handed down, DeAngelo stood up from his wheelchair, took off his mask, and told the courtroom,
"I've listened to all your statements, each one of them. And I'm truly sorry."
Nobody in that room owed him anything in return. Nobody offered him softening, and this isn't the place to offer it either. A man who broke into a stranger's bedroom in 1978 and screamed a dead relationship's name while he assaulted her. A man who tied up a lawyer and his wife with a decorative knot he clearly already knew how to tie, and beat them to death with wood from their own yard. A man who wore a badge through most of it, patrolling the same towns he was terrorizing after dark, close enough to his own colleagues that he helped search for a suspect who was, later, determined to be him. 40 years, 161 admitted crimes, 48 known victims, 1 DNA sample, sitting frozen since 1980, finally given a name. The case that took 40 years to solve ended up changing how every cold case after it gets worked. Genetic genealogy, the method that found DeAngelo through his own family tree, cousins who had no idea they were helping catch anyone, didn't stay a one-time trick. Law enforcement agencies across the country picked it up almost immediately. Cases far colder than this one, cases with far less evidence, started closing because of a technique that started here, in Ventura. With a DNA sample a medical examiner had the foresight to preserve twice, back when nobody knew what it would eventually be used for. Whether that's a good thing depends entirely on who you ask. It caught a man who spent a decade breaking into houses at night, and years after that, killing the people inside them. It also means a genealogy hobbyist searching for long-lost relatives has, in the process, made themselves and everyone they're related to searchable by police, forever, without ever agreeing to that specifically. Legislators are still arguing about where the line should sit. That argument hasn't finished. It probably won't for a long time. Lyman Smith never got the judgeship, never got anywhere close to the office his daughter says he was actually chasing. What he got instead was a death nobody could explain for 4 decades, and then, finally, an answer. One that came out of his own bedroom, off evidence nobody thought to look at twice until the technology caught up to it. Jennifer Carroll got her answer too. She spent the years since it arrived being honest about the fact that having it doesn't settle everything for her. She got the name of the man who killed her father. She's still not entirely sure the world should have had to give up what it gave up to get it. If you enjoy this coverage, join our community by subscribing to the channel. Every subscriber makes it possible for us to keep making videos we're passionate about sharing with you.